Welcome, friends. Let's think about what it would be like to go to Mars with SpaceX. What I'm talking about is something like a personal expedition to Mars. Not really a vacation because it would be quite a bit longer, but the basic idea is that SpaceX has been working on a plan to make space travel affordable for individuals. And what used to only be in the realm of science fiction is quickly approaching reality. So their central goal is to reduce the cost of space travel by about 4.5 orders of magnitude, which is about a factor of 30,000, which sounds just incredibly ambitious. And is it even possible? How are they even thinking about this problem? The first part of it is they want to establish full reusability, which buys the first factor of 300. So what they mean by this is to be able to launch, land, refuel, and launch again with little or no refurbishment along the way. Then for the next factor of 10, they want automated docking and refueling on orbit using the right propellant, which they've determined to be liquid methane and oxygen, buys another factor of 3. This is instead of, for example, liquid hydrogen, which is much harder to maintain and produce, store. And then finally, producing that propellant on Mars buys the last factor of 3. So how close are they to these ambitious goals? What they've done so far, they've established a very good launch cadence. In 2018, they had 21 launches, which is an amazing, about a third of the global total of about 60. And so far in 2019, I think they've launched maybe around 11. This is August 2019. I think they've launched around 11 now, and they have about 7 more that they've announced. So they could maybe get another 3 by the end of the year, which would be meet or exceed, hopefully, their numbers from last year. They've also announced the development of a new heavy lift booster and rocket, which is these are the vehicles that are actually designed to go all the way to Mars, which they call Starship for the rocket for the top part, the second stage, and Super Heavy for the booster, first stage. So these together, these vehicles are designed to take about 100 metric tons of cargo, which is about 100 people from Earth to Mars. The current the current vehicle, Falcon Heavy, can actually take a much lighter payload to Mars, but it's not really intended to take people. Full reusability. So this is the first factor of 300 that I mentioned. How far are they? How long are they on that? What they've done so far is they've established propulsive landings. So these are important because they don't rely on an atmosphere like parachutes and wings do. And their eventual goal is to actually put the rocket all the way back on its launch stand. Propulsive landings could also be used on the moon and not just Mars, but other destinations. And they've already successfully done this both on land and at sea. And the Falcon 9 boosters, which is their current kind of medium lift vehicle, those boosters have actually been reflown a number of times, so they've already established reuse in that perspective as well. To see some images, some video of what this is like, here's a Falcon 9 landing on a barge out in the ocean, floating in the sea. Here's another one. You can see the landing legs come down as they zoom right in on that central X target goal. And another, again, it descends. You'll see the landing legs come down. There they go. And then it lands accurately. So they've really been able to stick these landings pretty well. They have a very good record at this stage of putting these Falcon 9s back on the ground. And this last one now, this is 2 boosters. This is from the Falcon Heavy launch that put the Starman cargo up. So, and then in terms of automated docking and refueling on orbit, where they are there is that they have been able to accomplish this with the Crew Dragon vehicle. They've sent one up to the International Space Station, and it's docked. It just had a little mannequin in it and some cargo, so no people yet. Manned flight is planned, though, for this year, for December 2019. So hopefully they'll accomplish that goal on time. And this automated docking and refueling is an important design feature of the Starship vehicle. Then using the right propellant, so they've developed a new engine. SpaceX has developed a new rocket engine that they call Raptor. This engine will be used both on Starship and on the Super Heavy booster. It's in production. This is a methane and oxygen engine. They've just produced serial number 10, so the 10th one off the production line. And they've used one, they've done both quite a few tests now, and they've used one on the Starhopper vehicle as well. Then in terms of producing propellant on Mars, so this technology is very well understood at this stage. And actually NASA, not SpaceX, but NASA's Mars 2020 rover will do some testing along those lines, which will be great. The actual final propellant plant that would be deployed on Mars hasn't been designed yet, but they're, I think, in the process of they're on the road to that. So some technical hurdles do remain, things like this final propellant plant and the actual final, the rest of the development, of course, for Starship and Super Heavy. But at this stage now, these things really look more like engineering problems and not the fantasy that they did when this whole program was first proposed. So what are optimistic schedule estimates? In this year, SpaceX has already done a number of suborbital hops. Their last one was just a few days ago with Starhopper. So that's likely to continue, hopefully, with the Starship vehicle. Next year, 2020, well, we're expecting orbital flights to happen. These actually they're calling them orbital. They may end up being kind of fancy suborbital, like with a very high apogee, for example. We don't really know for sure yet. Then 2021, some on-orbit automated docking and refueling, hopefully. 2022, then, an unmanned moon orbit and return, as well as 2 unmanned cargo flights to Mars. The reason I've put unmanned moon orbit and return here is because SpaceX has entered an agreement with a wealthy Japanese businessman in exchange for making a substantial investment in SpaceX. SpaceX has agreed to fly him and a small number of passengers, maybe up to 10 to 12 total people, on this moon orbit and return. They're calling that the Dear Moon mission, so Dear Moon could happen in 2023, this moon flyby. And then the following year in 2024, we would have an unmanned moon landing and return, as well as 2 cargo and 2 crewed flights to Mars. That would be 4 total flights to Mars. These crewed flights would probably be a small number of people, smallish, like again, maybe 10 to 12 each. But with this, there'll be 4 total cargo missions and 2 crewed missions. So they should have quite a bit of landed mass there on Mars by that stage, which would allow them then in 2025 to get the propellant production working, and the following year to send the first flights back from Mars, which would then set the stage for 2028, so about 9 years from now, for the first passenger flight to leave Earth for Mars. Here's a video, not an animation, but an actual video of the Starhopper test flight that just happened a short time ago. This vehicle, you can see the single Raptor engine on the bottom. This vehicle is the same size diameter as Starship. It's 9 meters in diameter and about 25 meters tall. And so it's quite a large thing, and it's successfully tested. I think the technological achievement here is nothing small. There's a lot of complex bits and pieces that have to work together for this to be possible, and it was successful. So that's great. That's the next step. Travel time. So how long would this whole thing take to if we were to take an expedition to Mars? Mars orbital alignments happen only about every 2 years, roughly 25 months or so. So the next one is in 2020, then 2022, 2024, and so on. When these alignments happen, it takes about 3 to 7 months to get there. And then once you've arrived, the next possible return trip back, assuming you don't leave immediately, would be in the vicinity of 13 to 31 months. It depends a little bit on which orbital alignment period you're talking about. And then the flight back is might take a little bit longer than the outbound flight, so maybe 4 to 7 months for the return. And these travel times depend very heavily on the exact departure date within these launch windows. And the viable departure dates within those windows in turn depend on the cargo mass. So a lighter vehicle has a larger availability of dates. So your total time away, we're talking roughly 3 years with some variability. Here's an animation which shows the Mars and Earth orbits to scale. So you can see that the Earth orbit is circular and the Mars orbit is elliptical. And if we can see the dates there in the lower left, so we're coming up now on the 2020 alignment. So just before, right about now, July is when the mission would launch. And in coming up, I've slowed it down here now. September is about when they would be at their closest. And then go to full speed again here for the next alignment. They call these alignments oppositions. So Earth makes 2 orbits. So the Mars orbital period is about 687 days, so not quite twice as long as Earth. Then again, when Earth gets just a little bit before Mars, here and about now is when they would launch the missions, and then Earth catches up for the actual opposition there. So yeah, that's something about what the orbits look like. So you can see that when they're close, when Earth and Mars are close, it's much closer than when they can actually be on the opposite side of the solar system. It can be quite a long ways away. Oh, the cost. This is, of course, the big open question. The SpaceX has said that their goal is somewhere in the area of $500,000 to start with, maybe eventually being able to decrease that to as low as $200,000 or less, which they've said is about the cost of a median home in the U.S. My personal estimate is that the early flights, there'll be maybe, I'm guessing, significant demand. Also, they won't have their full cost structure, reduced cost structure in place probably by these early dates. So the might be something like $2 million a person, maybe, for these early flights. This would be, say, departing in 2028 and returning in 2031. So about a 3-year trip. That price would include the return trip. It would include your spacesuit, sending some cargo, and all of your food, air, water, housing that you would need while you're away. It may be that these prices could vary a little bit depending on how much cargo you bring. This is all still up in the air. In order to book a flight, so Elon Musk, the founder of SpaceX, is also the founder of Tesla, the car company. And the way that they do things is that you get in line, so to speak, to buy your car. And to do that, they require a deposit from you. So it's reasonable to expect that there might be a similar sort of process with SpaceX. Pay a little deposit, get in line. Then they may also require milestone payments as things get closer. So for example, when you go for training, possibly when you get fit for a spacesuit, things like that might trigger additional payments. And the big question for a lot of people, of course, is going to be how to pay for this. It's a lot of money, right? $2 million, even 500,000 is a lot. So the obvious first idea is just to self-finance it. So maybe you have some savings. Maybe you live in an area like Silicon Valley or New York City or something. You could sell your home. Maybe you could take out a personal loan. Maybe you could scrounge up some money from family and friends. You could go to Kickstarter. Maybe you could put a little personal business plan together to sell a bunch of Mars rocks when you get back, things like that. Another idea might be if you work for the right employer, maybe your employer would actually pay you to take the trip. Maybe they would cover the cost and your time, and then you could do some work for them while you're away. So this might be things like professional writers or photographers, filmmakers, geologists, sure there's a bunch of other potential business ideas that would be able to, that a company would be able to justify spending that kind of money to do. Then it's also possible that SpaceX themselves might offer financing. Again, they do this with Tesla. They offer financing and insurance actually for the vehicles. So that's another potential option. What about the risks? So space travel is risky. Going up in space with vacuum and all sorts of other hazards. Your ship might malfunction. Some equipment on the ship might malfunction. You need food and oxygen, and there's other things after you land. If you get sick or injured and you're far away from appropriate care, that could be a hazard. Minor illnesses and injuries, I'm sure, will be able to be dealt with, but something major may not be able to. Increased radiation exposure, both during the trip and after you land, presents a moderate increase in cancer risk. See, that's another aspect of risk. There's a risk of bone and muscle mass loss while you're away because of the zero G while you're in space and the low G on Mars. That's pretty well managed now. They've come up with some pretty good countermeasure techniques that they've worked out on space station, ISS, over the last few years, but nonetheless, it's a risk. There's also some, perhaps not small, psychological stress, both due to space travel itself. You're living in a fairly confined space for the travel time to Mars and back, and plus the associated isolation of both. And then there's potentially harmful exposure to vacuum, heat, and cold. My estimate is that very roughly, it's probably no more risk than other forms of adventure travel. If you go to Mount Everest, or if you were sailing around the world in the old days, or going to Antarctica or the North Pole, something like that, those were places no one had ever been before, and the travel was risky, no doubt about it. Training. So some amount of training is going to be almost certainly required before the trip. We don't really know the full extent of that yet. I don't think SpaceX has fully thought it through, at least as far as they've made public. But the kinds of things that you might want to accomplish in training include things like developing an understanding of the floor plans of both the spacecraft and the station on Mars, where things are, how they work, what things are possible, what things aren't, what kinds of equipment you might have available, how food works. It's going to be a little bit different, both in space and on Mars. How hygiene works, how you take a shower, how you use the bathroom, all of those kinds of things are going to be different. How and when exercise is going to be required, what sort of activities are going to be possible or prohibited. All of those sorts of things are going to be good subjects for training. You'll also need an environment suit. You might call them a space suit. I'm calling them an environment suit because they'll be useful not just in space, but on Mars as well. And so you'll need to understand how, why, and when to use a spacesuit. I've shown photos here of some prototypes from SpaceX, their recent prototypes. They're trying to improve the horribly bulky look of the spacesuits that are currently used on space station, which are really not that different from the ones that were used in the Apollo missions on the moon. They're huge, pressurized, basically little miniature spacecraft. So it looks like SpaceX has made some significant progress, and hopefully that will continue. So these suits, you'll actually, because the surface of Mars is close to a vacuum, you'll need to be able to carry oxygen with you. And it's also possible if you're working outside and you're carrying rocks around and working on equipment, it's possible your suit could get damaged. So you'll need to understand how to do repairs. There may be regular ongoing maintenance that will be necessary for who knows what, gaskets, or maybe you'll be gone a long time. What happens if you lose 10 pounds or gain 10 pounds? There may be sizing requirements. And also just the original fit may very well require custom sizing. The current spacesuits are extremely custom fit. The one one that's fit for one person is not suitable for another. Hopefully SpaceX will be able to generalize that at least to some degree. Here's a schematic of what the Starship vehicle may look like. This is a bit dated at the moment, but I think it's still useful. So at the rear we have some engines, and then in the center section are the propellant tanks. On the far left is the methane tank with some interior header tanks that are especially useful during landing, followed by the liquid oxygen tank, then some space for cargo, and the front section is for payload, which includes passengers. Zooming in on that passenger front area a little bit. So in this diagram, they're saying a pressurized volume of 825 cubic meters, which is greater than the A380 main deck. So the A380, as you may know, is the largest passenger airliner currently being made. It holds about 525 passengers, I think, but of course you're pretty well shoehorned in there. So we only have 100 people here in this space, so it's about 5 times more space per person. SpaceX and Elon Musk have said that they're actually extending this volume a little bit now. It might be 1,000 or maybe even 1,100 cubic meters in the current version of Starship. So even more space, which is good. Then they're suggesting here is we have like 3 decks of cabins. So 40 cabins total, so something like 13 cabins per deck. So it'd be maybe 2 to 3 people per cabin, plus some large common areas, central storage, a galley, which is a kitchen, and then a solar storm shelter. If a solar storm happens while you're in space, you will be required to enter the shelter to minimize your radiation exposure. So again, this is just a sketch. We don't know if the vehicle will even have windows for sure. I hope it will. I hope they can solve that engineering problem. We don't know for sure what the layout will be. I would expect, in addition to the things shown here, there'll probably be a small sick bay. Hopefully either in or near the galley, there'll be maybe room for a hydroponic garden and that kind of thing. So continuing now on the training front, so vacuum is another issue that you'll need to learn about. And this is again because the surface of Mars is a near vacuum. It has about 1% or so of the atmospheric pressure of Earth. And so it's important to understand the effects of vacuum on the human body and on materials as well. If you take or leave things outside, how it could affect them. And then how to use airlocks. The area that you'll be living in will be pressurized, and so you'll need to understand how to go from the pressurized habitat out through the airlock and into the outside work area in Mars, living area, exploration area in Mars, and including all of the spacesuit aspects of that, or environment suit aspects. And then punctures can happen too, because you're dealing with vehicles. Who knows, you could have a micrometeorite or some other accident or something like that could happen either in the ship or in a structure on Mars. So I suspect that it will be important for everyone there to understand how to both detect a puncture and to seal it if you find one. And also want to learn about watching out for extreme cold. The surface of Mars will be very cold, potentially very cold, and so you need to know how to detect that. Touching a cold surface with bare skin can be damaging, for example. Then some radiation awareness, both understanding just the nature and extent of your everyday exposure, as well as outlier effects such as solar storms, how to handle a radiation detector, what a low reading means, what a high reading means, and what the effects of radiation are on electronics. It may be, for example, that you won't be able to bring just standard consumer electronics with you on the trip. It may be that they can't withstand the combined radiation in space and on the ground. You might need specialized equipment for that instead. Then on the optional front, you may also want to do some zero-G or low-G training or simulations. There's a zero-G aircraft by a company called Novaspace. And there's also NASA has a neutral buoyancy pool. I kind of doubt they would make it available to SpaceX, but they might. Or maybe SpaceX would build their own, or maybe some third party would. And in both the aircraft and the pool, you can simulate both zero-G and low-G. So just as an example of what that's like, here's what it looks like in the pool. So here you have safety divers around someone in a spacesuit. This is a ISS training in the neutral buoyancy tank. So they set your buoyancy so that you're neutrally buoyant in the pool to simulate zero-G. They can also simulate a low-G, so they can kind of put a little too much weight on you, if you will. And they do this for a space station in order to practice maneuvers. This is a 40-foot deep pool, so it's a very cool, interesting place and experience, I'm sure. And yeah, they need to practice exactly what they're going to do many times to make sure they have it exactly right when they do a spacewalk. Then here's some people just goofing around inside a zero-G aircraft, the Novaspace aircraft. So you can see and get to float around. It's a series of these parabolic maneuvers that the aircraft makes. And again, you can do both zero-G and low-G in this environment. This is good in case you maybe want to get some feeling of whether you might be sensitive to nausea. I think is a good reason to consider that. It is a little bit expensive. It's about 6,000 euros, I think. Novaspace, at least currently, is doing something like 6 flights a year from Europe. I believe it's from France. On the packing front, so you'll need to pack enough supplies to last both while you're in space plus roughly 2 years on Mars. So that's quite a bit of gear. It's a lot more than you might take just for a little holiday overseas or something. If I'm estimating a rough limit of about 500 kilograms of stuff that you can pack yourself, plus another 500 kilograms that SpaceX will pack for you. The stuff that they'll pack for you would include things like food, water, air, other consumables. I'm thinking that they should give you menu choices. For example, if you're a vegetarian or a meatitarian, you should be able to choose the kinds of foods that you like and can tolerate. You'll probably have hot and cold options. And part of the reason that they'll need to pack this stuff for you is it'll need to be prepackaged. You can't just, whip something up, go down to the grocery store and whip up something on the stove. So most food will probably be vacuum sealed. It might be freeze dried, something like that. I don't know for sure. There might be also some onboard hydroponics if we're lucky, that'll be able to provide fresh vegetables, which would be awesome for those of us who eat and like vegetables. So one way this whole packing process might work is that because there's quite a bit, 500 kilograms, it's about 1,100 pounds of stuff. It's a lot of stuff. It's a little bit more than you could easily carry on a jet when you're going from your hometown to the launch location. So what might happen instead, SpaceX might send you several containers to your home by truck freight, maybe 3 months or so before the departure date, plus several smaller ones that you would use for carry-ons. And so you have a large one for the bulk of your stuff, smaller ones for carry-ons. And then I'm hoping that they will actually also send you a scale, so you don't have to rely on something like a bathroom scale or go buy a scale of your own. So you're having and this is because weight is actually a very important aspect of your luggage. It's much more important to manage weight very carefully on a rocket than it is on an airplane. So your carry-ons, though, they won't be small either, because you'll need to have enough gear to cover you for the whole 3 to 7 month flight. So not small. And the reason I think that they might send you specific carry-ons and larger containers is so that you are sure to conform to specific size and shape. so that baggage, those luggage, your carry-ons, and so on, can be uh, carefully and thoroughly anchored in the spacecraft. You don't want them bouncing around. You don't want to just put a briefcase in an overhead rack and then have it fly out and hit someone, hurt someone. Also, the containers may well be made from some lightweight material, again, because weight is an issue in space. So then you take, let's say, 2 months to load the containers, checking weight carefully as you go. When you're done, you then call up the freight company and they ship that large container and maybe a couple of the carry-ons. You maybe don't want to carry all the carry-ons with you on an aircraft. So you ship some of them back to SpaceX, and then you bring the last 1 to 3 maybe with you on the plane. One issue to think about when packing is that exposure to vacuum can damage certain items. And that may mean that the cargo has to be pressurized. We don't really know for sure if the cargo will be pressurized. If pressurizing it actually makes it a little bit heavier, so there's some arguments that we may not want to pressurize it. But even if it is pressurized, transporting liquids in luggage may be prohibited or limited. If it's not pressurized, of course, transporting liquids would be an extremely bad idea because liquids can just boil off and completely evaporate in a vacuum. But because of that, there's that risk. They may well impose limits on that. SpaceX might. I think there'll probably be a whole art and science in deciding exactly what to bring. I'm sketching some general guidelines here, but I think there are a lot of specifics that will become more clear as the time gets closer. So in addition, you'll want to think about bringing spares for items that may not be replaceable easily or at all after arrival. For example, things like glasses or contact lenses, certain medications, specialized health aids, things like that. You may want to bring extras. You won't be able to just pop down to your local grocery store or pharmacy or optometrist or whatever to replace things like that. Another thing that will influence your packing is that many activities that seem kind of normal and everyday on Earth won't be possible on Mars. For example, there's no trees, no wildlife. It's a near vacuum outside. It's very cold. You can't survive too long away from base camp. So obviously, bringing a tent, just as an absurd example, wouldn't make sense. And then even seemingly simple things like binoculars wouldn't be usable the way you would hope. So you might think bringing binoculars would be cool, let you see to a distance, but when you're outside, you can't bring them up to your eyes because you'll have that spacesuit or environment suit shield in front of your face. Then, as I mentioned earlier, electronics may need some radiation resistance. That might mean you need to either not bring certain electronics. Maybe you need to buy radiation hardened electronics of some kind before you go. It might be an interesting market for someone. Then another thing to consider is what the power requirements are. Devices that use a lot of power are probably a bad idea. All the power on the spacecraft and on the ground will be provided by solar. I think power conservation will be an important kind of everyday issue that people need to deal with. The amount of waste that's created, again, both in space and on the ground, is an issue. And then finally, salvage value should be considered. It may be, when you reflect on this for a moment, it may be that you don't want to actually end up bringing almost anything, just maybe absolute bare minimum of the stuff that you take to Mars, you may want to bring back with you. And the reason is twofold. Number one, your weight may be limited on the way back, just on that basis. And number two, it might be that you want to bring a bunch of Mars rocks, for example, instead of a bunch of old clothes. So there's that. I suspect that many new tools and techniques are very likely to be invented just for people who are going to Mars. It could be a very interesting and fun kind of thing to think about and work on and be involved with developing those ideas. So finally, our next leaving Earth. So the process there will be first you travel to the launch site, of course, probably Cape Canaveral for 2028. So you just fly there in a commercial airliner. You bring your last few carry-ons with you. Once you arrive, get settled, I suspect that SpaceX is going to want to have thorough inspections of all of your luggage and carry-ons to make sure that you aren't bringing any items that are just plain unsafe or that have, for one reason or another been put on their, you know, not to be brung list. Then you'll have a final pre-launch briefing. So my expectation, my thinking here is you might arrive, could even be a couple of days before the launch, just to have time to, for everything to work everything through and settle and avoid any surprises and maybe weather delays on the aircraft side, even things like that. So your final briefing then discuss what the weather is like, whether, for example, that might mean potential delays or launch windows, what the timing is of the launches, and any other last minute details that they want to think about, process oriented details, things like that. Then when the time comes, so SpaceX, I'm sure, will take care of loading almost everything, maybe everything of your luggage and carry-ons on the vehicle. So when comes time for you to get on the ship, then you just walk yourself without having to carry anything of your any carry-ons or any material like that. Get on the ship. To have some sense of size, Starship has an external diameter of about 9 meters, which is about 40% wider than a Boeing 747, which is 6.5 meters. And of course, it's Starship is also multi-level, as you saw in the diagram earlier. When it comes time to launch, SpaceX may require you to actually wear your spacesuit during the launch period, which is the way they do it on Space Shuttle. The reason for that is in case there's some anomaly during the launch period that maybe a piece of debris hits the vehicle and causes a leak, and there's a loss of pressurization or something minor like that. At least you'll be able to deal with that. Then you'll find your seat. You'll strap in. Hopefully, if the seats are in your cabin, we don't really know if the seats will be in your cabin or they might be in a common area. We don't really know for sure. My guess is it'll be in the cabin, but I really don't know. At each seat, though, I am expecting there to be video monitors which show you the launch process and let you observe, what's happening outside and see the countdown and all of that kind of thing. And then finally, when the time is right, you will launch. And just to give you an idea of what this is like on the space shuttle, what it used to be like, here is some video from an actual launch inside the cockpit. So you can see they're bouncing around. And one guy's got a nice smile on his face. They're in their spacesuits. He's able to lift his arms and so on. So it's not, the G-forces aren't too horrible. And here's an animation that shows the launch process in a little more detail. So we're walking onto the vehicle across the gangway, boarding. After everything is fueled up, we don't really know if it's going to have those windows or not, but hopefully we'll have something like that. Again, this rocket's 9 meters, or about 30 feet in diameter. It's about 118 meters tall. 35 Raptor rocket engines on the bottom. Fires on the Super Heavy booster. We have liftoff. And clear the tower. And we're on our way up to orbit. So the flight to orbit. So the Super Heavy booster will burn for about 3 minutes. Then we'll have a short pause for staging, followed by Starship burning for another 6 or 7 minutes. And the acceleration that you'll feel will increase as the rocket burns its fuel and thereby lightens its load. You'll experience some moderate vibration along the way, as you saw in the space shuttle video. Hopefully not that bad, but maybe that bad. And then with a rough maximum G load of somewhere between 3 to 5 Gs. And eventually then you'll reach low Earth temporary orbit, roughly 250 kilometers above the surface, at which point the engines will be off, of course. And so you can then unbuckle, remove your spacesuit, enjoy some zero-G fun, and hopefully a view of the Earth below. The next step then is to wait for refueling. We don't know exactly how this is going to work yet. There's a couple of different ways it might happen. And because we don't know how it will work, we don't know how long it will take. It might be just a few hours, but it could also be a week or more. It's possible that the Starship will rendezvous with a single pre-fueled ship. That would be one of the fastest ways it could happen. Or it might be that you would need to wait for, say, 3 to 5 tanker launches to come up from Earth and rendezvous with Starship and transfer fuel. So once the vehicle is refueled, you strap in again, and then the engines fire again and off to Mars. So again, an animation. So we pick up from where we were before, continuing up with super heavy, get through the maximum aerodynamic pressure point, and then on the edge of space, you can only imagine the view is going to be great. The stages separate, super heavy falls away. Little attitude control jet pushes it back. The main Starship heads to parking orbit, that 250 kilometer orbit I mentioned. And here we go with Super Heavy firing its engines and heading back to Earth. This is the same as what happens today with the Falcon 9s that we saw the video of earlier. Then booster lands back on its original launch stand, hitting that X smack in the middle. In the video here, we have instant refueling of the booster. Of course, that will take some time. Then lifting the tanker, which looks exactly like Starship. It is Starship, it's just a reconfigured Starship, onto the top of the booster. The booster then fires again. We basically now repeat the whole process from before. This is part of how we get our reuse. And then the ships rendezvous. When they rendezvous, the refueling process, they'll dock end to end like this. And the ship on the left has the fuel, transfers the fuel into the ship on the right. And the ship on the left, the tanker, returns to Earth to be reused again. Again, they've shown it here, completely refueling in one mission, but in reality it takes several, because the ship on the left, the tanker, actually needs to use some of that fuel to achieve rendezvous. It doesn't arrive with full tanks. So the tanker returns to Earth, and Starship fires its engines and departs for Mars. On the way to Mars, so one of the very early things that needs to happen is that the solar arrays need to be deployed, and probably also some form of high-gain communications antenna. So these will be pretty crucial milestones. If you don't have solar arrays, you're going to be in very bad shape. Then another thing that'll happen is that the crew and passengers need to adjust to zero-G life. You're going to be up there for 3 to 7 months. Should be fun, but there could be issues. As I alluded to earlier, some people develop nausea in zero-G, basically a kind of a mild form of motion sickness. It is treatable. My understanding, it is treatable basically with motion sickness drugs. And I also understand that most people, although maybe not everyone, get used to it after a while. Another thing is that the way objects move and the way you move, the way people move, is very different in zero-G. It's kind of a little bit counterintuitive if you haven't thought about it a lot or watched a lot of people move in zero-G. Because there's no gravity, things don't fall, they just move in a straight line. And so this involves yourself as well as anything that you are touching or handling. And also, in particular, it involves water and other fluids. So this is one thing you need to be a little bit careful about, because it's easy to make just a huge mess on yourself and everything around you because the water doesn't fall, or like onto your shirt or something. It can go on the ceiling, it can go on the floor, it can go on your neighbor. It can be bad. Sleep is also something that might take a little bit of getting used to because there's no pressure, there's no gravity holding you down, and which I guess is good because you don't really need a bed. And you may just sleep vertically, which is what they do on ISS, as I'll show you in a minute. And then food and drinks, the way you eat and drink will be different because, again, because you have no gravity, there's no plates and cups, utensils, none of those things really work. Odds are you will just have your food in a little package that you will eat by squeezing it and consuming it through a straw, probably. That's what they do on ISS. And when you're moving yourself in the vehicle, you can't just stop yourself. You can't. There's no, when you're coasting through air, you can't grab onto the air to slow down. You don't slow down naturally, so you need something to grab onto to slow yourself down. And that unfortunately means it's possible to launch yourself into a wall or into others and hurt yourself or somebody else. So this is hopefully one of the things that they'll cover in the training. But there should be plenty of rails for both your hands and your feet, as there are on ISS. So here's our Starship. We're deploying the solar arrays. It's interesting, not shown in the video here, but the vehicle will have to be oriented towards the sun with respect to the solar arrays. And then we're on our way to Mars, and we're traveling quite fast at this stage, probably in excess of 60,000 miles an hour. So what is that? More than 100 times the speed of a conventional aircraft. And yeah, just coast the whole way there. Should be peaceful, quiet. Probably not a lot to see, but maybe. So here's a video taken inside the space station. You can see the little handrail that the astronaut grabs onto. This whole little room here, that's basically his bedroom, and that green thing on the right there, that's his sleeping bag that he's touching. And so that's where he sleeps. He just climbs into that, puts his feet up, and kind of curls up. And again, because there's no pressure, there's no pressure spots with respect to sleep. Don't need a bed. Sleep vertically. You can sleep on the ceiling. It doesn't really matter. And you wake up, and that's it. Now here's an example of this astronaut moving around inside the vehicle. You see those blue bars, little hand and foot bars. You can see the straps on the bottom of his feet, basically holding his pants in place. Some shoes there, which people have taken off because they're stocking feet. Lots of handrails, lots of stuff just attached to the walls. He's got that plastic bag there in his hand, which he's going to fill up with water in a minute. You can see he's just coasting down the middle of the vehicle. Lots of handrails. No real sense of up and down. It's just respect to what the direction the camera is pointed. So what he's doing is he's putting that bag and this device on the wall and telling it how hot he wants the water to be and how much water he wants to have. And the machine then fills the bag with water. And push the button, click, bag starts filling up. And then to the left there where that white napkin is, that's a small refrigerator where they can keep cooler things. So you'll have a choice of hot water, cold water, other cold items to mix with your food. So once the bag is full, turn off the device, remove the bag, attach the straw. You can see it's got that little valve on the top. So you push the valve and suck. And he's going to show what happens here in a second. If you're not careful, it just forms a little bubble there, which can get all over everything. So yeah, it's the nature of eating and drinking in zero G. So on the way to Mars, I'm expecting that passengers should have access to onboard Wi-Fi. I'm thinking that there should be like an onboard server with just a gigantic library of movies and music and lectures and books, lots of stuff to keep you entertained during that 3 to 7 month period. I'm also thinking that there could be or should be a big cache of static internet content. So maybe you won't be able to browse the web with the full flexibility that you can on the ground, but maybe stuff like, I don't know, Wikipedia or something like that will be hopefully available on board. I'm also thinking that there could be or should be bandwidth to access the internet back on Earth, but that it will be limited by the amount and the time of day. So, and just for broad comparison, there's a satellite in orbit around Mars called Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, and it sends about between zero point 0.4 and zero point 0.5 megabits per second from Mars to Earth for 10 to 11 hours a day. So I'm hoping that SpaceX will be able to meet or exceed that both at Mars and from a Starship. The thing about this is, though, that access to the internet won't be instant because there'll be a speed of light delay. So your access requests may be queued. You might say, hey, I want to read the following URLs or something, and then come back, I don't know, a few hours later or something and be able to get them. Email is probably the same way. Email is, I think people are used to the kind of delayed, queued nature of that. So hopefully that won't be a problem. I'm expecting that you'll be able to send video and audio messages within limits. You obviously don't want to send hundreds of gigabytes of, giant, day-long HD files or something, but, short files for friends and family should certainly be possible. I'm also expecting that there should be some optional group activities, things that a group might have fun doing. I'm not sure exactly what that would be, but and some mandatory safety drills. Kind of my mental model for this is something like a cruise ship. So on a cruise ship, they have these safety drills with the life rafts, and then they have a bunch of pre-planned group activities that you can choose to participate in or not. So something like that may well work in a confined space, long duration trip for Mars. So I'm sure you could hide out in your cabin the whole time, but if you want to socialize and have fun with the group, that'll be possible too. I'm also expecting that it will be possible to communicate with the Mars base. So as we said earlier, I'm expecting there to be at least 2 crewed missions that'll already be there. So that'll be, say, 20 to 24 people. So it might be interesting for those of you on the ship, those of us on the ship, to be able to get to know the people who are already on Mars and what are they like, what are they doing, what things are they experiencing, what stuff is working well for them, all of the kind of horror stories and other kinds of stuff that people like to know about, new environment that they're going into, new people that they're going to be with, and that kind of thing. Bone and muscle mass happen quickly in 0G, so to help offset that, you will need to exercise. On the space station, the crews exercise for 2 or more hours a day, 6 days a week. So I expect that to be the recommended pattern for Starship as well. You will also need to continue to exercise even after you've landed. We don't know exactly how much, but there may be a few windows that will allow you to see outside. We don't really know for sure. I think that windows are likely to be a bit of an engineering challenge to build them into the ship. So I don't know how big they'll be, but hopefully there'll be some at least in the cabins and maybe more. There may also be a hydroponic garden for fresh grown vegetables. It could be a fun thing to even work in if you wanted to have a little job to keep yourself busy on the ship. There should also be a doctor and a small sick bay available on board in case of illness or nausea or whatever. But the important thing to know here is that no matter how sick you get, there is no turning back. The ship can't turn back no matter how serious your condition. For that reason, I think SpaceX will probably be a little bit selective in terms of who they allow to go on these trips. Having someone get seriously ill would be bad news for everyone. Elon Musk has mentioned wanting to have a restaurant of some kind. I'm not really sure how that would work with pre-prepared food, but hey, it's possible. There could be some interesting ideas there that people could come up with. And Musk also says that he wants the trips to be fun, which gets back to the socialization aspect. And again, there's lots of room for innovation here. And exactly what's possible will depend a lot on the layout of the ship, to be honest. So here's a video that shows some of the exercises that are actually done on the space station. This is a stationary treadmill, some weightlifting, stationary bicycle, and you can see again here the weightlifting and weightlifting, bicycle, and running in place. You can see it's got the elastic straps there holding him down. The impact from that, by the way, they found is very important for to minimize bone loss. Arrival and landing. So when you get to Mars, the approach will probably be straight in. That is, we won't be orbiting Mars first. So during that approach, as we come up on Mars, we'll need to repack all of our personal items that we had loosely laying around and in use, strap down our carry-on gear. It's possible that Mars may not be very visible from the windows, which would be kind of a little bit sad, but if there are windows, just because of the direction that the approach happens from. And when we get a little bit closer then, take your seat, strap in. It's possible you need to put the spacesuit on again, as with the launch. Again, don't really know for sure about that. Starship actually enters the atmosphere belly first to using friction to burn off speed as it descends. That's why we don't know about the windows and what you'll be able to see, as the windows are likely to be facing the other direction. Then when we're close to the ground, Starship will turn somewhat and ignite its engines for about 40 seconds for the final descent and landing. The G loads will be somewhere in the area of 4 to 6 Gs, so maybe a little bit heavier than during the Earth launch period. And the landing itself, though, should be fairly gentle. The ships don't have elevators, so after the ship lands, because it lands upright, the way to get off the ship may involve riding a little built-in crane down to the ground from the upper payload section. Here's an animation that shows this. Here we are on approach, doing a straight in. Now we're doing our belly first approach. We're burning off speed, turn, fire the engines. Here they have landing legs. Don't really know about that part yet. Starhopper did not have retractable legs, but Falcon 9 does. Okay, so we've landed on Mars. The housing is likely to be in structures that are either built on the surface of Mars or maybe a few meters below. That'll be done by this crew of 20 to 24 people that got there before us. So the crew on the ship will help unload, I think. Probably be a joint effort. I imagine maybe everyone will help to some degree. And then the gear will need to move to its final locations in the habitats. The fuel for the return trip will be manufactured somewhere close by. Can't probably be too far away. So after a short period, maybe I'm guessing around 30 days, the ship should be fully refueled and ready for its departure back to Earth. This won't be for you, though, although I could imagine maybe that some people who kind of changed their mind at the last minute or something might want to go back. Maybe that's possible. I don't know. Doesn't seem impossible anyway. And again, on the surface, we'll have internet and data access and communications, probably similar to what was the way things worked on Starship. And again, the surface power will be entirely from solar arrays, as it was on the ship. So here's a artist's impression of what the first bases might look like. Here we can see 4, I guess, ships, including the one in the far right in the distance, some kind of paving. They've got a vehicle. They've got a little dome where they're growing some plants, some above ground structures, and yeah. And then also notice the large solar array on the right. The environment on Mars, so it's about 38% of Earth's gravity, which means you'll be able to lift things that are about 2.5 times as heavy as they are on Earth. So that'll be interesting. Plus, you'll be able to jump about twice as high, which is kind of cool. And that light gravity and jumping and so on, that might actually make for some pretty interesting new sports and new games and maybe fun spins on old ones. I can imagine playing basketball on Mars might be pretty wild. Then, so outside, as we talked about before, it's a near vacuum with an atmospheric pressure about 1% of Earth. The temperatures are, the average low temperature is about minus 88 degrees C with an average high of about plus 4 degrees C. These are what was observed by the Curiosity rover in the Gale crater. Curiosity was landed on Mars a few years ago, and it's still there now. That's quite a large range, as you can see, from say, high noon to the middle of the night kind of thing. The Martian day is pretty close to the Earth day, about 24.5 hours long. The daylight sky is red, and interestingly, sunsets are blue, so it's the reverse of Earth. The Martian day is about twice as long as the Martian year is about twice as long as the Earth year, about 687 days. And they do have seasons there due to the axial tilt of Mars. And in addition to the axial tilt, the distance to the sun from Mars also varies because it's in a reasonably elliptical orbit, as we saw in that earlier animation. So when Mars is closer to the sun in its ellipse, things can be a little warmer than when it's further away. In the northern hemisphere, the spring is about 7 months long. Summer and fall are each about 6 months long, and winter is about 4 months long. And to just give you a starting time, winter in 2028 begins in March. So winter on Mars in 2028 is in March. It's different, opposite, of course, in the southern hemisphere. So northern is, which is where the likely landing sites are that have been picked so far, is nice because it has the much longer summer and short winter. So, of course, as we've talked about before, environment suits will be required whenever you're outside. So it's very important to take good care of them, maintain them carefully, perfectly. And you also will need to bring your oxygen with you whenever you're outside. Because of that, of course, you can run out of oxygen. So that's another important reason for training. You'll need to go through an airlock to move between inside and outside. So that's a whole process to do that. You'll probably be in constant radio contact with your friends and coworkers when you're outside. And you'll need to be trained and prepared, as we talked about earlier, to repair spacesuit damage that might accidentally happen. I'm also expecting that everyone will be equipped with an emergency beacon. That way, in case your radio fails or in case you somehow get isolated and something happens, you'll be able to hit your beacon because you won't be able to just yell for help, right? No one can hear you. So what would you do during the day? The most obvious thing, I think the thing probably most people are interested in, is exploration. But in my mind, the most interesting stuff will all be outside. So you probably want to use some kind of buddy system and never go out alone, just in case something happens to either one of you, the other one can get help or call for help. There may be pressurized vehicles, which would be really cool, like the one we saw in that artist rendering a few slides ago. But if those are available, it's likely that they'll be heavily used, and so just for personal exploration, they may not work for that. I think rock hunting and cave hunting will be two pretty interesting and exciting things for people to do when they're outside. Also, experimentation is another possibility, just stuff related to the low 1/3 gravity, and there may be a bunch of other things that are only available or possible on Mars. Gardening could be really fun, growing your own food or other plants on Mars. So something that's never been done before could be fun, exciting thing to experience and be a part of. Hydroponics is one possibility, and maybe there's other ways yet to be discovered. Hobbies, various hobbies people have on Earth. Could be new hobbies they develop on Mars. Sports, as we mentioned earlier, photography will certainly be, I think it's something a lot of people want to spend time on. And then if you're lucky enough to have an employer um, send you, there's also a work aspect. Here's just a still shot. This is taken from, again, the Curiosity rover. An example, kind of the title slide of this talk was another example taken by Curiosity. What you can actually see is the actual surface of Mars looks like. It's a very varied environment. Radiation, so surface radiation on Mars is a lot higher than on Earth. And the reason for this is that there's no magnetic field. Actually, even a compass won't work. And then, of course, the atmosphere is only 1% of the density on Earth. So between that in space and surface exposure, as I mentioned earlier, there is some increase in cancer risk. It's not a huge increase, we don't think, but it is something to be aware of. That radiation may damage some electronics. And again, as we mentioned earlier, there may be that may impose a requirement to bring rad-hard versions of electronics with you instead of the standard commercial types that we're used to every day. Habitats will eventually need to be shielded, probably by surrounding them with dirt from the surface of Mars. It's the most logical source. Exactly what that will look like, we don't know yet. Might also be slightly subsurface. There'll be another approach to that. Solar storms are another radiation source to be aware of. They produce a much higher amount of radiation, much larger amount, but they're relatively short duration, a few hours or something like that. On the ship, they will certainly require taking shelter. On the ground, it depends on how large the solar storms are as to whether shelter is required or not. After dark, so my estimation is that most interesting activities are going to take place during the day. I suspect very few people are going to want to be outside in the dark just because so many more things can go wrong when you can't see as well. It may be that for work purposes, industrial-ish kind of purposes, that maybe some large lights will be assembled out there, but then it's also colder and it's just generally more hostile at night. So I think a lot of the kind of common things that are available on Earth, eating, cooking, hobbies, friends, cards, games, reading, movies, music, dancing, drinking, all those kinds of things will be certainly possible. Even alcohol, although I suspect it will be rare for a while, my guess is that alcohol will be present on Mars. All sorts of low G fun that people could have. It's not 0 G, but still 38% G could be really cool. A lot of fun stuff to experiment with and try and play with in that environment. And of course, exercise. You've got 2 hours or more of exercise to do every day, or 6 days a week. Eventually, maybe it won't be quite, maybe we'll be able to figure out that we don't need quite that much because humans haven't spent a lot of time in low gravity environments yet. The effects aren't fully known, but to begin with, at least, I would expect 2 or more hours a day. And then you could spend some time after dark on the internet, communicating with friends and family, just like you would if you were on Earth. Probably a similar system as on the ship. That is, things are queued with some local servers, for things like movies and so on. The distance from Earth to Mars varies from about 60 million to 400 million kilometers, which means that's about between 3.3 and 22 light minutes one way, or twice that for a round trip. So when you're on the opposite side of the solar system, that's like 44 minutes. If you want to send a message to someone, but if they were to respond immediately, that would be the soonest you could get a response. So, I would expect a typical pattern. You might be able to get a round trip or two in the course of an evening. Sure, why not? The crew. So SpaceX is going to need paid crew members, crew on the ships, crew on the ground. But my expectation is that there'll be a fairly small number of spots and that there's going to be a lot of competition for those spots. For some jobs, the work may offset the flight cost, but probably not completely eliminate it. Exactly what that will look like is obviously a SpaceX policy. Maybe more skilled jobs it would completely offset it, like it might if you were working for an employer. but for less skilled jobs, if you're going to be, I don't know, a waitress or something on Mars, maybe it wouldn't. So possible jobs that could be up there. I think most of the jobs that people are going to want, or that SpaceX is going to want, and it will be in demand by the people living there, are going to be skilled jobs. I've made a long list here, which I'm not going to read through, but you can use your imagination. I think a lot of skilled jobs are going to be necessary. In terms of qualifying for these jobs, being able to do more than one will certainly be a big plus. And that's what I would recommend for people who would like to pursue this direction. Develop skills at more than one key job. An economy, it's a little hard to predict what the economy is going to look like at this stage, but I wouldn't be surprised to see a significant barter component. There's probably going to be some form of money. It might even start with just Earth-based money used remotely, over the remote internet or whatever. And the reason I say that is that probably I'm expecting that one of the things that people on Mars might most want to spend their money on is being able to send stuff to themselves on Mars. Obviously, if you've actually made the move and you're not just there on vacation or as part of a personal expedition, you might want to buy stuff which you then have shipped to you in the next flight out. Details here depend very heavily on the SpaceX policies, how they pay their crews, how they charge passengers and Starship for things after, both on the ship and after arrival, how they allocate resources, how they regulate activities, how they restrict imports and exports. This could be completely hands-off. It could be, everything could be free, no need for money, or it could involve a little free market. We don't really know. It could be totally free market. It could be totally micromanaged. Everything could be free, or somewhere in between. We just don't know for sure. It'll be very interesting to observe, though, for sure. So finally, leaving Mars. Now we've been there for a couple of years or so. So the process of getting back is pretty similar to leaving Earth. As I mentioned earlier, it's possible that the allowable weight will be less on the return trip than it is on the way there. Maybe only 25% of the outbound weight. So maybe only 125 kilograms of cargo instead of 500. Deciding what to bring actually could be very challenging. You may end up leaving most of the stuff that you brought and just taking back rocks and similar souvenirs. The rocks are likely to be much more valuable, both to you personally and if you want to sell them to help cover the cost of your trip. So you'll still use Starship, but just the upper stage for the return, no booster. There might be less crew on the way back. Maybe that some or most of the crew maybe might want to stay on Mars instead of coming back. The launch itself is a single stage to space and then direct to Earth. There's no on-orbit refueling needed in this direction. The total travel time might be slightly longer than the outbound flight just because of the way the planets move. Then finally, last slide, arriving and landing on Earth. So the diagram shows what it might look like. It's pretty similar, I think, to the Mars approach. That is, you'll have some advance warning, you pack up, you eventually put your suit on and you strap in, then you burn speed off against the atmosphere for maybe about 18 minutes. It's about 2 to 3 Gs on the way in. You have a final turn, a powered descent, and a soft landing. You probably land at the same place you left from, which is Cape Canaveral. Once you land, though, it may actually take a little bit of adjusting to get used to 1G gravity again. And finally, your total travel time, start to finish. Remember from what we said before, 3 to 7 months travel in each direction. So let's see, what is that? 6 to 14 months in space, maybe. So it could be up to a year in space, let's say, total. 13 to 31 months on Mars. 19 to 45 months total. I think 3 years is a reasonable average expectation. So I think this could be extremely exciting. I'm really looking forward to living vicariously through everyone that decides to go, and hopefully the SpaceX vision of colonization will eventually happen. Thanks, friends.